Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome. Today, we're tackling Jacksonian democracy.
Ah,
Between 1800 and 1848, huge GE changes.
a pivotal era for sure.
You bet. And you've brought us some fantastic sources to unpack all of it.
Absolutely. We've got excerpts from The American Yop,
Love that book.
some great videos from Heimler's history,
Yeah, his stuff's always good.
and a couple of in-depth PDFs. Should give us a pretty complete picture, I think.
Perfect. So, Jacksonian democracy. It's about larger-than-life figures. It's about intense political battles.
And it's about huge shifts in how the people engaged their government.
Buckle up, folks. This one's going to be a wild ride.
You know, it's interesting. This whole era really lays bare the contradictions of building a democracy.
Oh, how so?
Well, you've got the ideals, individual freedom, popular sovereignty, all that.
Right, right.
But then you can't ignore the issues, right? Slavery, economic inequality, the treatment of Native Americans.
Complicated times, for sure. It forces us to really examine the complexities of the period. It's not simple black and white.
Okay, let's get into it. So the American Revolution, it was all about promoting those democratic ideals, right? Liberty, equality, all that.
Yeah, but here's the thing. Many of the founding fathers, they weren't so keen on too much democracy.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's kind of ironic. The American Yop has this quote from Alexander Hamilton.
No way. The $10 bill guy?
Yep, that's him. He actually praises the British monarchy. Can you believe it?
Wow. That's not what they teach you in school.
In Elbridge Gerry.
Wait, he signed the Declaration of Independence, right?
He warned against an excess of democracy, said it was dangerous.
What were they so afraid of?
Well, a lot of them, they feared mob rule, instability. They thought giving the people too much power would lead to chaos.
So they preferred a more controlled system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Checks and balances, limited popular influence. That's what they wanted.
So much for power to the people. But here's the thing. Those anxieties they had, ordinary Americans weren't really buying into it.
Right. Especially out west. Those folks were really drawn to democratic ideals.
The American Yop talks about how they were active, petitioning Congress, getting involved in politics, really expressing their belief in popular sovereignty.
It was a real grassroots movement.
And voter participation exploded. In 1824, it was about 350,000 votes. By 1840, over 2.4 million.
Amazing, right? I think westward expansion played a role too, all those new states joining the Union.
A lot of those frontier communities, they had a different social structure.
More egalitarian, not so bound by the old hierarchies of the East Coast.
Which all leads us to the Missouri Crisis, 1819. That was a major turning point.
It's in the textbook, and Heimler's history does a great job explaining it in his video too.
So Missouri wants to become a state. Seems simple enough, right?
But then, the question of slavery.
Oh boy.
It ignited this nationwide debate. And it revealed how deeply divided the country really was.
North versus South.
It really exposed that fault line running through American politics.
The North was gradually moving away from slavery,
But the South was becoming more and more reliant on it.
and it almost ripped the nation apart.
The Missouri Crisis. It's like a case study in the fragility of the young nation.
So how do they prevent a complete breakup? The Missouri Compromise, 1820.
A classic American solution.
Missouri enters as a slave state, Maine as a free state, trying to keep things balanced.
And they drew a line
Ooh.
right across the Louisiana Purchase. No slavery north of that line.
It was meant to solve everything, but we know how that turned out.
Yeah. It just delayed the inevitable. The issue of slavery's expansion never really went away.
It's like they put a Band-Aid on a much deeper wound. But the compromise itself, I mean, that's a theme, right, throughout American history.
Definitely. Compromise, it's necessary for unity,
hmm
but it rarely satisfies everyone.
And sometimes it just kicks the can down the road. The problem doesn't go away.
Because you can only do so much in the moment.
And then enter Andrew Jackson.
Now, there's a character for you.
The man is a product of his time.
Embodies both the opportunities and the dangers of this era.
War hero, man of the people.
But also deeply, deeply controversial.
It's like his life is a study in contradictions.
He came from humble beginnings, but became a wealthy planter, a powerful politician.
Championed the common man,
Yeah.
but he also owned slaves.
And he supported policies that were really harmful to Native Americans.
That's what makes studying him so fascinating. He's just complicated.
For sure.
The American Yop tells this crazy story about how Jackson survives a duel. He gets shot in the chest, but he just stands there, takes it like a champ.
Talk about grit.
That's how he got the nickname Old Hickory.
Makes sense. He was known for being tough, unwavering.
He becomes a national hero after the Battle of New Orleans.
War of 1812. Crushing defeat for the British.
And then there is his role in acquiring Florida from Spain.
His methods were a bit unconventional, shall we say.
A bit, yeah. The American yop doesn't sugarcoat it.
The Florida incident.
Yeah.
He basically invades Spanish territory, executes 2 British subjects.
Yeah, he was acting on his own, didn't even have orders.
Shows you the kind of guy he was. Defender of American interests no matter what.
And that sets the stage for his presidency.
Absolutely. So the election of 1824.
Total mess. Jackson goes up against John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, William Crawford. Brutal fight.
The Democratic-Republican Party was really fractured at this point.
Jackson wins the popular vote, but
Nobody gets a majority in the Electoral College.
so it goes to the House of Representatives.
And that's where we get the corrupt bargain.
Yes. The infamous bargain.
Slay comes in 4th, so he throws his support behind Adams, who ends up winning.
And what does Adams do? Appoints Clay as Secretary of State.
Jefferson and his supporters, they cried foul. Said it was a backroom deal.
Jackson felt cheated. It fueled his distrust of those elite politicians.
Understandable, really.
And then the 1828 election.
Oh, man.
Even worse.
Vicious. Personal attacks, mudslinging everywhere.
They went after Jackson's wife, Rachel, questioned the legitimacy of their marriage.
It really hurt him. Deeply.
Politics can be brutal. It's tragic. Rachel dies before his inauguration.
I think that really cemented Jackson's view of things. The establishment was out to get him.
He was the people's president, out to shake things up.
The era of Jacksonian democracy was born.
So much happened during his presidency.
Expansion of suffrage, the rise of mass political parties, the president taking a much more active role in policy.
And it was all driven by this idea like, the common man deserved a say.
Of course, it's important to remember that vision of the common man was pretty limited.
Right. Definitely something we need to unpack further.
It was a democracy for some, but not for all.
Okay, so let's get into the specifics. How did Jacksonian democracy actually play out? One of the biggest changes, it's got to be voting rights. States start eliminating property requirements.
Huge increase in the number of white men who could vote.
The PDFs you brought, they highlight this massive surge in voter turnout. Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, they were some of the first to adopt universal white male suffrage.
It was a trend spreading across the country.
And as more people got the vote, the political parties had to change too.
No more King Caucus.
That's where party leaders in Congress basically chose the candidates.
Exactly. It was an elite system. Jacksonian democracy swept that away.
Nominating conventions, that becomes the new way. Broader participation.
It was a big step towards greater democratization, empowering the people to choose their leaders.
And campaigning, it becomes a spectacle. Rallies, parades.
Mudslinging, unfortunately.
Oh, yeah. Plenty of that.
Well, it's natural, right? You've got to appeal to a much larger, more diverse audience. Got to use whatever tactics work.
Jackson wasn't afraid to play rough.
It was us versus them. He was fighting against the corrupt elite.
And that resonated with the common man.
The people who felt ignored by the establishment.
So let's talk about some of the big conflicts. The nullification crisis. That really put federal power to the test.
Absolutely. It stemmed from Southern opposition to a tariff. They hated it.
The Tariff of 1828.
Himmler calls it the Tariff of Abominations in his video.
Okay.
Pretty accurate.
It was meant to protect northern industries.
But Southerners saw it as a blatant attack on their interests.
And that's where John C. Calhoun comes in.
Jackson's vice president. Staunch advocate for states' rights.
He came up with this theory of nullification. Can you break that down for us?
It basically said that states could invalidate federal laws they thought were unconstitutional.
So like a veto power for states.
Yeah, exactly.
In South Carolina, Calhoun's home state, they put it to the test.
Good time.
Declared the tariff null and void. They even threatened to secede if the government tried to enforce it.
Talk about a crisis.
Yeah.
Almost tore the country apart.
Jackson, he was not having it.
Our federal union, it must be preserved.
A famous quote.
He threatened to use the military against South Carolina.
And Congress passed the force bill, giving him the authority to do it?
You can see that clash between personality and principle. Jackson, the war hero, defending the Union against a state threatening to leave.
Yeah, that's pretty intense.
He refused to let a state defy the federal government. And he was ready to use force to prove it.
Eventually, things cool down. Henry Clay brokers a compromise. The tariff gets reduced. South Carolina backs down.
But that underlying tension between state and federal power,
Yeah.
that doesn't go away. It's still with us today.
It's like some things never change.
The nullification crisis, it shows those deep divisions in the country, and it foreshadows what's to come, the Civil War.
Okay, from a national crisis, let's shift to something that might seem smaller, the Eaton affair.
Sometimes called the Petticoat Affair.
But it's actually way more than just gossip. It reveals a lot about Washington, D.C. and how power worked there.
Absolutely. Gives you a glimpse into the social and political dynamics of the time.
So John Eaton, Jackson's Secretary of War, he marries this woman, Peggy O'Neill Timberlake.
She was already kind of a social outcast. There were rumors,
Rumors of an affair while she was still married to her first husband.
and the Washington elite, they did not approve, especially the wives of other cabinet members. They snubbed her.
Which, of course, made Jackson furious. He saw it as a personal attack.
He was fiercely loyal to his friends.
And remember what happened to his wife, Rachel, during the 1828 election.
Those attacks were brutal.
So he sees what's happening to Peggy, and it brings back all those painful memories.
He felt like she was being unfairly targeted, just like Rachel.
And this is where the social dynamics come in. Women in Washington, they couldn't vote, they couldn't hold office.
But they had a lot of social power.
They could make or break your reputation.
Their influence was huge.
Jackson, he wouldn't stand for it.
He defended Peggy Eaton, challenged those social norms.
He was willing to alienate some pretty powerful people.
Right.
Didn't care. He was going to stand up for what he believed in.
It shows his character, right? His loyalty, his willingness to fight for what he thought was right.
The Eaton affair. It ended up causing a huge shakeup in Jackson's cabinet.
Several members resigned, rather than deal with all the drama.
Jackson wanted control. He wouldn't tolerate dissent.
He was stubborn, determined.
And that's Jackson in a nutshell, right? Complicated, contradictory, compassionate one minute, ruthless the next.
He's a product of his time. The best and the worst of that era, all rolled into one.
And that makes him fascinating to study.
Definitely.
All right, we've covered a lot, but there's more to come. Before we get into Jackson's war on the bank, let's take a little break. We'll be right back to continue our deep dive into Jacksonian democracy.
All right, picking up where we left off, the second bank in the United States. Jackson's war on the bank.
This wasn't just some policy disagreement.
No, not at all. This was personal for him.
He hated that bank.
It was like this symbol for him of everything he despised about the elite, all that power, all that corruption.
He thought it was designed to help the rich get richer at the expense of everyone else.
Remember, Jackson always saw himself as a protector of the common man.
He even called it a monster when he vetoed it.
Yeah, his distrust of the bank went way back.
Like to the Panic of 1819.
Exactly. That economic crisis, it devastated so many Americans.
And he blamed the bank for it.
He thought the bank had way too much power. Power over the government, even. He thought they were influencing elections.
And let's be honest, he really didn't like Nicholas Biddle, the bank's president.
They were like rivals, two powerful figures locked in this battle.
It was a clash of titans.
And this whole fight against the bank, it really fired up Jackson's supporters.
Oh yeah, they loved it.
They felt like the system was rigged against them. The bank was just another example of that.
And Jackson was their champion, fighting for them.
It tapped into a very real sense of anxiety, distrust of those big institutions. People felt like they were being left behind.
So Congress votes to recharter the bank in 1832.
And Jackson says, nope, vetoes it.
Bold move.
It was. He was directly challenging Congress.
Shows you how far he was willing to go to get rid of something he thought was corrupt.
His veto message, it's actually pretty brilliant, if you like that kind of populist rhetoric.
Oh yeah, he goes off.
Calls the bank dangerous to the liberties of the people, says it favors the rich and powerful.
Base ate it up.
They saw him as this fearless fighter, standing up to the establishment.
But this wasn't just politics for him. It was a personal crusade.
He even said, the bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it.
Wow. Strong words.
He meant it. This was a life or death struggle for him.
And he wins the 1832 election after vetoing the bank.
Which just reinforced that image. He was the champion of the common man, wouldn't back down.
But he doesn't stop there. He wants to destroy the bank.
Totally dismantle it.
He tells his Secretary of the Treasury, take all the federal funds out of there. Put them in state banks.
His opponents, they called those state banks pet banks.
Accused him of cronyism, right?
Exactly. They thought he was just rewarding his buddies.
This whole thing, it shook up the financial system.
Big time. It was a huge gamble. And some people argue that it led to the Panic of 1837, that major economic depression right after Jackson leaves office.
So yeah, he won the fight against the bank.
His supporters loved it.
But there were some serious consequences.
Definitely. It raises some interesting questions. about democracy and economic stability. How much control should the people have over the financial system? That's a debate we're still having today.
For sure. Jackson's bank war. It makes you think about populism and the balance of power.
It shows that even well-intentioned actions can have unintended consequences.
All right, moving on. Let's talk about Jackson and Native Americans. This is a dark chapter in American history.
It is. And it's important to understand its full impact.
Jackson, he believed in Indian removal, moving all the tribes west of the Mississippi.
He'd fought against Native Americans in wars. He saw them as an obstacle to westward expansion.
He thought this removal policy would be good for everyone.
He said it would open up land for white settlers and protect Native Americans from conflict.
But, of course, that's not how it went down.
Not even close. The reality was far more brutal.
The Indian Removal Act of 1830. That gave him the authority to make treaties with the tribes, to get them to move.
But a lot of those treaties, they were coerced. The tribes didn't have much choice.
They'd been living on that land for generations.
Yeah, they weren't going to give it up easily.
And that resistance, it led to forced removals, like the Trail of Tears.
A horrific chapter in American history.
Thousands of Cherokee forced to march from their homes in Georgia all the way to Oklahoma.
The conditions were terrible. Disease, starvation, exposure.
Thousands died.
It's a stain on Jackson's legacy.
And it's not like the tribes didn't fight back.
They did. They challenged the removal policy in court.
The Worcester v. Georgia case, right?
Yep. The Supreme Court actually ruled in their favor. Said the state of Georgia couldn't force them to move.
But Jackson, he ignores the ruling.
He said, John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it.
Talk about defying the Supreme Court.
He was determined to get his way, even if it meant breaking the law.
It's a tragic reminder, you know. Even the highest court couldn't protect Native Americans from the injustices they faced.
And the impact of Jackson's removal policy is still felt today by those communities. It's this legacy of pain and displacement.
It's a dark side of Jacksonian democracy, for sure.
It shows how the expansion of democracy for some often came at the expense of others.
Okay, so while Jackson is fighting the bank and pursuing his removal policy, a new political force is emerging.
The Whigs.
They were a direct response to Jacksonian democracy.
The anti-Jackson Party. They opposed everything he stood for.
His policies, his leadership style, his populism.
They thought he was too powerful, too dangerous.
They believed in a stronger federal government, and they saw Jackson's actions as overreach.
They wanted a more balanced approach to governing.
They were big on economic development, supported a national bank, tariffs to protect American industries.
Internal improvements, too. Roads, canals, all that stuff.
It's amazing how they came together as this organized opposition to Jackson.
They even called him King Andrew I.
They thought he was acting like a tyrant.
They saw themselves as the defenders of the Constitution.
The name Whig, that was a deliberate choice, right?
Yeah, it connected them to the American Revolution. Those early Whigs, they were fighting against British tyranny.
They were making a comparison between Jackson and King George III.
They came from all over the political spectrum.
Yeah.
Former National Republicans, anti-Masons, even some disillusioned Democrats.
What united them was their dislike of Jackson.
Exactly.
And their emergence, it marks the start of a new chapter in American politics.
The two-party system, Democrats and Whigs, battling it out. That's what dominated national politics for decades.
It's a legacy of Jacksonian democracy, in a way.
It provided this framework for all those debates over slavery, states' rights, the future of the Union.
Issues that Jacksonian democracy, with its focus on the common white man, didn't really address.
Right. And that brings us to the limitations of Jacksonian democracy. All those big changes we talked about.
Expanding suffrage.
But it didn't extend to everyone.
No, it didn't. African Americans, women, Native Americans, they were still excluded.
The common man, in Jackson's vision, it was a pretty limited concept. It was white men.
And while some states were expanding voting rights, others were taking them away.
Especially from Black Americans. The American Yop talks about New York and Pennsylvania. They adopted new constitutions that restricted or even banned Black suffrage.
That's messed up.
It is. It shows the hypocrisy of the whole thing. Equality and opportunity for some, but not for all.
And that limited vision of democracy had consequences, big consequences.
Absolutely.
It contributed to the tensions over slavery and ultimately to civil war.
It's a reminder that progress isn't always a straight line. It's messy,
Uh,
contradictory.
so Jacksonian democracy, it's a mixed legacy. It expanded opportunities for some,
But it reinforced existing inequalities for others.
and it left a lot of questions unanswered.
Questions about the nature of American democracy itself.
Hmm.
Who gets to participate? Whose rights are protected? We're still struggling with those questions today.
And that brings us to the end of part 2 of our Jacksonian democracy deep dive.
But we're not done yet.
There's still more to explore. We'll be back shortly to wrap things up and talk about some key takeaways from this fascinating and challenging period in American history. Wow, we've covered so much ground today. Jacksonian democracy, it's a lot to unpack.
It is, from those founding fathers and their worries about too much democracy.
Right. To Andrew Jackson himself, that whole complicated legacy.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how those events from way back then, they still kind of echo today, you know?
Yeah, for sure. So, for our listener who wants to keep learning, where should they go next?
Me, I always say go straight to the source. Primary sources.
Like,
Letters, diaries, speeches, legal documents. You can find that stuff online, in libraries.
get right into the minds of the people who lived through it.
Exactly. It's like stepping back in time.
The PDFs we have are a good start.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But there's a ton more out there.
It's amazing how much is available now.
And don't forget the visuals.
Oh, right.
Paintings, illustrations, political cartoons. They give you a different perspective.
Especially those political cartoons.
Oh, they're great.
Super insightful and funny, too.
Sometimes, yeah.
It's like they're using satire, caricature to comment on what was happening back then.
And it still works today.
Totally. They make you think.
It's a good reminder, too. People have always used humor to deal with tough times, to poke fun at the powerful.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, before we wrap up, I have one last question for you. Jacksonian democracy. It had its triumphs, but also its failures.
A very mixed legacy.
What are the big lessons we can learn from it? What's still relevant today?
Good question. I think the main takeaway is this. Democracy, it's not a guarantee. It's not something that just happens automatically.
I have to work at it.
All the time. We have to participate. We have to challenge injustice,
Yeah.
fight for equality wherever we see it.
It's easy to take our freedoms for granted.
It is. But they weren't just handed to us. People fought for those rights. And we have to keep fighting to protect them.
We can't assume that progress will just keep happening on its own.
Nope. We got to stay engaged. Hold our leaders accountable. Demand a better society for everyone.
And that's where knowing our history comes in, right?
Absolutely. We have to understand where we came from, the good and the bad. Learn from the past.
So we can build a better future.
Exactly. And remember, progress.
Yeah,
It's not always a straight line.
definitely not.
There will be bumps along the way. But if we understand our history, those complexities, we can make better choices.
Well said. It's been a fantastic deep dive into Jacksonian democracy. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
My pleasure. I always enjoy talking about this stuff. It's important, you know. It forces us to face some hard truths about our past and think critically about where we're headed.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope you learned something new.
And that you keep asking questions.
Keep the conversation going.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a fascinating topic. Until then, keep learning.